Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today for November 5th, 2024, US election day. We're going to talk about Mexico today in this session. So before I introduce our speaker for today more formally, let me just point out the upcoming talks. The next couple of weeks, next week, we will have Destiny Knox. She's an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University who focuses on energy poverty. And she's also the CEO of People Energy Analytics. The following week after that, we'll have a talk about oil geopolitics by Clay Siegel, who's an energy and geopolitical risk strategist. But today, it is a pleasure to have with us today Ariel Ramos, who's a founding partner of Ramos Marcin Abogados. He's on the International Board of Advisors for the University of Texas at Austin here. And he's coordinator of the Oil and Gas Clean Hydrogen Committee and former president of the Mexican Academy of Energy Law. So just a little bit of background on Ariel. He's an energy and projects lawyer. He's been practicing for more than 30 years. Graduated from the Escuela Libre de Derecho in Mexico City, 1993, and has a master's of law from here at the University of Texas Law School in 1995. He's practiced energy law in both the US and Mexico for more than 25 years, representing private and public clients. He's participated in first private power projects in Mexico, or independent power producers, assisted with public-private partnerships, E&P in the oil and gas and renewable energy projects. And he's been involved deeply in the energy transition advising groups who are involved in energy transition initiatives. Member of the Mexican Energy Academy of Law, in which he has acted as president, currently chairs the Oil and Gas and Green Hydrogen Committee. Also a member of, as stated, International Board of Advisors for UT Austin, and he's been acknowledged as a leading lawyer in energy projects, natural resources, and government procurement by publications such as the Chamber of Partners and IF Law 500 and Who's Street. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Ariel. He's not going to have a formal presentation, but he's going to speak for 30 or 40 minutes. But I would like it to be relatively interactive if you can. So at any time in the audience here in the room or online, if you have a question, please ask it immediately, and Ariel will pick you, or I will indicate to him we have a question online. With that said, well, let's welcome Ariel Ramos.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with all of you, and it's incredible that 30 years ago I was one of another student here in campus, and it has been a little bit of a while, but believe me, it has gone really, really fast. So, and I want to thank, of course, the Engineer Education Research School for the invitation. I think that this topic is more relevant, is really relevant more than ever. Especially today, it's an historical day here in the US, and it has been an historical year for our both countries. Energy, as we're going to discuss it, we know that it's actually of the essence for the development of any country, or the development of our world, and more specifically in the case of North America. North America as an energy hub, if integrated, could become actually the largest energy hub in the world. And that's one of the pending items, and that's one of the focus of our discussion, because this represents many, many challenges. Please, if you have any question, either technical or about some of the facts that I'm going to share with you, please feel free to just raise your hand and present yourself, and we'll go through it. So just a little bit of background. Energy in Mexico actually started getting more developed in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when a number of basins basically close to the Gulf of Mexico were discovered. All those resources were developed by foreigners. Then, before World War II, President Lázaro Cárdenas decided to actually nationalize the oil and gas industry, which was actually a big shock worldwide, because it was the first country ever to do that. But at the time, Lázaro Cárdenas had the support of the then President Roosevelt. So that actually allowed Mexico to negotiate with the foreigners how they were going to pay for the assets. Just a clarification, in Mexico, different from the US, the oil and gas reserves belongs to the nation. So those are basically publicly owned. So the nationalization was not about oil and gas. That was already Mexican. It was nationalization of assets at the time. So for many decades after that, Mexico was actually sanctioned by the private oil and gas company and the general market in many ways because, of course, the big companies didn't want it, other countries to follow, as you can imagine. So this actually happened for a number of years. And a state company, Petróleos Mexicanos, is where Mexican NOC was created at the time. But it was not until 1970s when one of the largest oil basins in the Gulf of Mexico was discovered. And that specific basin, when it was started to be developed, unfortunately, was mishandled by the Mexican government in many ways. Basically, in order to develop it, Pemex actually started to get a lot of indebtedness. It started to assume a lot of debt. And then by the end of the 70s, basically because of how the conflict between the US and the Arabic oil countries, basically the price of oil actually dropped from approximately $27 a barrel to approximately $6 a barrel. So that actually created a financial crisis in Mexico. Mexico didn't have money to pay. So that actually led to one of the largest financial crises in the history of Mexico back in the 80s. And that caused also the Mexican government to have to reshape and change basically its economic policies. As a result of that, in 1992, the then president, Carlos Salinas, promoted an initiative basically to open the market partially in energy for private investment on two fronts. One was basically a power to allow certain activities not to be considered like public services. And that allowed actually the private sector to participate directly and own 100% of the assets. That included independent power producers, included also a type of self-supply structure, cogeneration, and also exportation and importation of power. Now, exportation and importation, unfortunately, at the time, there were not many interconnection points between the Mexican grid and the US grid, but that has been partially developed throughout the years. The other aspect that was open was basically natural gas, or as we call it, non-associated gas to oil, which basically allowed private participation in, especially in transportation through pipelines. So basically, at the time, only Pemex owned pipelines, but at that point, private participation was allowed for the developments of a number of pipelines. Nevertheless, the difference today on pipelines, including also oil pipelines, and between the US and Mexico is quite large. In the US, you have more than 600,000 kilometers, and in Mexico, we have between 60 and 70,000 kilometers. So and unfortunately, the pipelines do not reach as much as we would like to. And one of the reasons is because Mexico, for many, many years, did not, both industry and also households, did not actually consume natural gas, different from the US. And that's one of the reasons why, the pipelines and distribution lines did not actually reach or had a reach similar than the US. And I'm going to tell you at the end just a story about the difference on culture and some of the issues between our countries that has caused for many years, like having like a mistrust of each other. But I'll get back to you. So it was not until, and with respect to E&P, exploration and production of oil and gas, that was exclusively reserved to Pemex. But one important element here was back in the 90s, after 92, was actually Mexico entering into the North American Free Trade Agreement at the time, which was an free trade agreement between the US and Canada. And it was decided that that agreement was expanded to include Mexico. And it was the first time in the history of humanity that a developing country actually entered into an agreement with developed countries to share trade not only in goods, but also in services and provide protections of investment. What people doesn't know is why actually the US was interested in allowing Mexico to enter into the free trade agreement. And the reason was energy. I mean, the only thing we have to remember that back then, the president of the US was President Bush Sr., and he was an oil and gas guy, right? And he did business with Pemex for many, many years, back in the 70s, and also in the early 80s. So he knew actually the potential of Pemex, and he knew actually what he wanted was to open the oil field service and supply of equipment and services system of Pemex to the US providers. That was really the reason why it was of the interest of the US to allow Mexico to enter into. Everything else, really, they didn't care that much about it at the time. Unfortunately, the size of the Mexican market, and especially after the 80s financial crisis, was quite low. I mean, Mexico, just to give you some figures here, the internal production of Pemex was of approximately $350 billion at the time. At that time, Texas was 280, just to give you a sense. Now, because of NAFTA, Mexico was able to increase their GDP to 1.3 billion, and just Texas is far more than $2 trillion, right? So, this gives you an example of how a treaty that was not necessarily, I mean, we covered a lot, but the main purpose of the treaty was not actually to cover or to promote that many industries, but it did. And it also helped Mexico to overcome the crisis. In the energy space, as I said, unfortunately, the startup was really slow, because why not? In the 90s, after we entered into NAFTA, why not? We broke again the economy, right? We had another financial crisis. Again, things were mishandled, and back on December 93 is what we call in Mexico error de diciembre, or mistake of December. They allowed the Mexican pesos to float. It was before that it was fixed, and we had actually a devaluation of approximately 300% from one day to the other. So that, and there were a lot of debts in dollars. So you can imagine, this also caused another financial crisis. That being said, so the startup of NAFTA was quite slow, and the startup of all the energy market from the private side started really slow because of this, right? And but nevertheless, it happened, and it happened that I was able, actually, I was fortunate enough to participate in the first private power projects, not by choice, to be honest. I mean, it was not, I didn't choose it, but I was the new guy in one of these big law firms, and they said, okay, this is yours. And I said, I'm sorry, there should be a mistake. I don't know anything about this. And they, why me? He said, you're the new guy, nobody wants to see me, so good luck. Then you have a weekend to sort it out, right? And get started. Fortunate for me, I studied here at the University of Texas, and I took courses of energy. And at the time, I remember that people asked me, why are you taking energy? In Mexico, everything goes through these public entities. So I said, well, it might become handy one day, right? And it did. So then, just to make it shorter, it was not until 2013 and 2014 when there was an agreement, which was called Pacto por México, in which basically the Constitution was amended to just fully open the energy market. And the rationale behind this change was basically to say, look, our Mexican energy companies, meaning Pemex, and on the power sector, the Federal Electricity Commission, CFE, basically they are technically broke. So why don't we just, and we need this to happen, so why don't we just allow the private sector to do it? Let's just open finally E&P. Let's just fully open electricity, and let's just have Pemex to focus themselves on what they do best, which is not really on the downstream. Let's not have Pemex focusing on refineries. Let's just have Pemex focusing more on E&P, and by doing that through associations with the private sector. That was the idea. If you ask me, the mistake of that is, and this is typical of politicians, is that they wanted to show the market and and Mexico, that this reform could actually develop immediate results, which, as you know, as engineers, is not possible. I mean, you need to give time, you need to allow actually things to mature, and most importantly, you need to give also the public energy entities time to adjust to be able to compete in some aspects. Probably not in other, but in some aspects they should. And unfortunately, that administration was not actually of that idea. They wanted to show that everything that was going to develop results. And the other big problem, which is another big lie of politicians, they always were saying, and by the way, the cost of fuels are going to be reduced, the cost of power is going to be reduced, and against reality and against all the data and information that showed otherwise, right? So that's what happened. And then for other political reasons, on 2018, there was an election in Mexico, and then as a result of that election, we had like an ideological turnaround. Left-wing government actually arrived. They actually decided that the most pressing thing to do was just to look to support the public energy companies, that everything that was done in the past was wrong, and that they needed to restrict the access to the market to allow the public companies, meaning Pemex and subsidiaries and CFE, to just be able to refinance their debt one way or the other, and then be able to compete and control the market again. Which, of course, and also with the same premises. We're going to lower the cost of fuels, we're going to lower the cost of power. Of course, neither of those actually happened. So now we have a new administration in Mexico, which is basically a continuation of the previous administration. They actually have the same ideology in many ways. And nevertheless, it is important to note that they acknowledge, not publicly, but at least in face to face, they acknowledge that they have a couple of small challenges, including lack of public funding. The Mexico public deficit, unfortunately, is reaching historical heights. Which, by the way, I mean, what happened is that politicians doesn't like to go back to history, but if every time that Mexico has had that kind of level of deficit, nothing good has happened, by the way. So history teaches something, right? And also the rating agencies have actually stated that Mexico is going to be a negative watch unless they actually reduce the public deficit to levels between 3 and 4%. Right now, the level of deficit, it reached like 7%. Right now, it's almost at 6%. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on public finance on that side. And on the other, they have acknowledged that they require the private sector to do the things that they want to do. Now, the other big challenge is the things they want to do. They want to continue to focus in cleaning up and the finances of Pemex and CFE. So either you do one thing or the other, right? And unfortunately, the order of the factors here is really important and essential. But what I'm going to outline now is some of the ideas that they have, some of the principles, the ideological principles of the strategy of this government. And you're going to see that sometimes these ideological principles challenge reality and challenge the objectives and how to reach those objectives. So as you can imagine as well, publicly, and that's why what we read in the news is not necessarily how this government is going to operate, but nevertheless, it creates confusion and uncertainty. And of course, people want to invest, in Mexico in the sector, but they want to understand under which rules and under which kind of structures. So just to give you an example of some of the ideas that they have in mind, with respect to oil and gas, in E&P, I believe that it's good news. This is not right now public, but they have been discussing about allowing fracking in Mexico. The previous administration actually was quite strict to say that there was not going to be no fracking. But one of the principles of this administration is government energy sovereignty and national security. So how are you going to reach that if all the gas you have, you import it from the US, right? And then on the other side, I don't know if you read in the news some weeks ago that the US government just realized that they are allowing permits for exportation of gas to Mexico for this gas to be liquefied and then basically resold to other markets like the Asian market. And they say, hey, wait, no, that's, I mean, we don't want that to happen. That actually happens, probably we gotta do it. But of course, we know the big challenges for the development of energy facilities, especially in the Pacific coast of the United States. So there is actually, we have in Mexico the Mar de Cortés, which is between the Baja Peninsula and the continent. And that area is, it actually, I'm not going to say perfect because of course it has its environmental challenges and issues, but technically speaking, it's actually better. So there could be business for everyone. There is actually one project that has been lingering around for more than 20 years. I have seen that project actually change hands many, many times. But now that it actually seems that it could happen, now we have this statement from the US government saying, hey, I might actually restrict, my permits for the use of this kind of resource. But going back to fracking, just to give you a couple of figures, in Mexico, north part of Mexico, central north part of Mexico, we have the continuation of the Eagle Ford Basin. The Eagle Ford Basin actually was basically the source of all these fracking euphoria, say in a way, and frenzy that actually happened back in the 2010s. And it allowed in an 8-year period investments that linger more than $600 billion, just to give you a sense. Just in this basin. We're not talking about Marcelos or other kind of basins. Well, these basins, it happens that continues down to Mexico. So although you would need to do your geological studies also in the Mexican side, as many of my clients and contacts in Texas say, they say, look, I have my equipment here. Why do I need to go down to Argentina to do work in Vaca Muerta with a government that I don't like? And taking, why do I have to take a plane that is going to take me many, many hours? Well, if I have all my equipment, just bring it across the border, I'll put the security there, and I'll make it happen. And I just take my chopper, jump the border, and see how my operation is going. As easy as that, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is that my understanding is that the geology shows that on the Mexican side, actually the basin goes deeper. So just a matter of physics, it's possible that more oil, shale oil, would be the proportion between shale oil and gas would be higher of oil in the Mexican side than on the US side. So the potential, non-studies, partial studies have been done, not full studies, but the potential is just amazing. And it happens that all this area in Mexico is actually controlled by organized crime. So if you actually bring the investment, if you bring the people that are experts in doing this, then you might resolve, two big problems for Mexico and for the US as well, because you would take out their most important element for organized crime, which is the youngsters. You would need to actually work. And of course, you would need to allow also all these contractors and E&P companies to do what they do best. And they know how to provide protection to the people. Of course, these increased costs. This would mean that the Mexican government would need to actually allow them for a full deduction on taxes on any of those costs, but it is possible. Pemex doesn't have the technology to do it. They don't have the money to do it. But of course, Pemex, you want to learn? We'll team up with you, right? I mean, we're not communists. So we can teach you how to do it. Similar thing on this last point with respect to deep water. I mean, Pemex doesn't have the money. Let me tell you a story, a terrible story. Back in the 60s, when deep water was starting to be developed in the North Sea, in Europe, somebody in Pemex said, it might be a good idea to send some engineers to learn what these guys are up to. And probably that knowledge could be handy one day, right? And so they sent actually a group of engineers. So in the 70s, when all these big oil and gas basin was found in shallow waters in Mexico, which, by the way, it was found by a fisherman. A fisherman actually was, while they fishing, he saw a big pool of oil, and he thought, probably was an accident or something. So he reported back to Pemex, and when they checked it, and it was almost, almost on the surface. It was so easy to bring it out. So when they discovered that basin, the government said, you know what, we don't need to learn deep water or anything. So what are these guys doing? Well, they're learning these new techniques and say, no, they're on vacation. For sure they are drinking beer, in Aberdeen. No, bring them back. And so instead of having right now, like 50 years of knowledge of the water, basically Pemex has 0. So they need to actually team up with the private sector for that. And there are ways to do it. Right now, the regulation allows them to do that under certain conditions. So we have discussed this with the new administration, so they know it, they understand it. Well, not fully understand, but they see it like, all right, you know what? Let's explore that kind of option. Another idea that they have, which I personally don't like, is unfortunately Mexico, we still ban gas, which is, by the way, by law, it is forbidden. It is considered a crime, but technically speaking, it still happens. So the gas from the oil production in the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico, basically they ban gas. They don't actually, they put it into pipelines and use it for consumption. The reason for that has a history with the US. So back in the 70s, when they actually discovered this big basin, they said, well, by the way, Mexicans do not actually use gas. So what do we do with it, right? So they decided, well, somebody in the US was the idea, you know what, let's just build a big pipeline that would go from Texas all the way down to Campeche, and let's just put that gas into a tube and then just sell it to the US, right? And at the time, the price of gas here in the US was actually quite high. Was it approximately a little bit more than $21 BTUs? So they started negotiating with the Mexican government, and the price they got was like, if I recall correctly, like $6 at the time, which was a fantastic price. So, but once the negotiation was done, the US delegation said, now we require actually approval from the Energy Department in Washington. So they went back and they said, look, we got this great deal. We're going to build the pipeline. And this is the price. And somebody in Washington who didn't know anything about international relations or Mexico say, why $6? No, go back, offer them $3. Say, no, but the negotiation is closed already. Say, now what are they going to do with the gas? Are they going to just flare it? I mean, they're going to bend it or what? Say, well, we don't know, but the negotiation is there. So they went back to Mexico. They said, we need to reopen the negotiation. The delegation of Mexico went to the president and said, what? No deal. And we've been venting gas for 50 years. And that pipeline didn't happen. And that's why, it's just an example of how a good deal could actually go wrong because of a bad decision. And also has generated distrust, between our countries in these kind of fields. Just going through this again, the other issues that the government wants to support is petrochemical. Honestly, for me, it doesn't make sense. But they have this idea of also putting money into petrochemical plants. They want to do cogeneration based on some of the remains of the refineries here that Mexico produce. That's another bad idea because this would be actually dirty power in many ways. But they have this strong idea about no, we're going to allow Pemex to do cogen. Actually, Pemex did cogen in the past. It was a mess, and it was quite dirty. So that's another idea they have. I don't know where that's going to end. Another one is fertilizers. Fertilizers is an issue. It's an issue worldwide, especially also with what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine is it used to be one of the main sources of fertilizers. So unfortunately, the fertilizers, it had been a terrible story in Mexico because they were used to be owned by the government. Back, in the 80s was one of the industries that was 80s and early 90s was privatized. And then the private sector didn't do anything really with it. So Pemex, a couple of administrations ago, bought it back at a really high price and terrible conditions with a revamp plan that Pemex decided, saw it and said, you know what, I have a better plan. And their better plan didn't work. So now they want to again revisit the idea of producing fertilizers. Another big issue they have is water supply. I mean, water supply for Pemex and for their operations, it's a big problem. Water supply in Mexico in general terms, it's a big problem. And 2/3 of the country is semi-desertic, and all the superficial water is not for human use. And we were actually suffering one of the worst dryouts ever in the history of Mexico. That was partially resolved by then some of the worst rainy seasons that we have ever had in this same year. But again, all these requires a lot of investment. There are a lot of companies that have been really, really interested, especially companies from Europe, also companies from Asia, specifically from Korea and from Japan that are interested. But of course, resolving a water issue which does not actually respect the border, right? And requires a lot of, the water basin includes several jurisdictions, and putting together all those jurisdictions and having them meet, actually acknowledge first that they have a problem, and second, that they're not going to have control of the process, that needs to be the federation. It's also an issue. Also, the oil and gas pipeline system requires a lot of investment. During the previous administration, basically oil pipelines was developed and storage capacity was developed by the private sector, basically because the importation of fuels were open. That has been partially closed, not formally meaning that no change in the legislation has happened, but partially because some of under the argument that there was a lot of thieves or stolen fuels from Pemex, they used that as an excuse to start shutting down operations on the private sector and also not allowing them to renew their permits. And there were some changes with respect to the term of the permits, which was an issue. Because look, I did an investment base that at least my permit was going to have a certain term, right? And if you reduce that term, that has an impact on my finances, on my deductions, on all my business plan. So this has not been yet resolved, but at least the new administration has the idea to just say, you know what, let's just allow the private sector to do it, but together with banks. That's the other thing. What they want to promote more is more public-private partnerships. I was able to participate in the development of the first public-private partnerships in Mexico, first non-energy related, but then we started doing those for Pemex and for CFE. So there are ways to do it. And for these people who the most important thing are politics and their public speech, what they want is to show to the market that, Pemex is there, right? Or CFE is there. So, okay, you know what? To the extent that the economics are there, whatever makes you happy, right? In electricity, and this goes back to some of the principles that challenge with reality. So we have energy sovereignty on one side, national security, and then they want to support CFE, provide financial support, no money available, public money, I mean, and they put a rule which, please don't laugh, doesn't make sense, that the Mexican power utility needs to have at all time 54% of the generation of the installed capacity in generation. And the private sector may not hold a title over more than 46%. So the rationale behind this, there's no rationale, technically speaking, economically speaking. This is more about some politicians saying that way we show that Mexico actually has the control. Now, what we're actually developing with some and have developed in the past with the private sector is, look, they want to say that they own the capacity. That's fine with us. Let's just install actually the plants. Let's just ask them to deliver us the fuel. We'll basically do like a maquila of generate the power. We'll give it to them. We're not even gonna have a permit for that because it's gonna be owned by them. They're gonna be the ones who are gonna put it into the market. So officially speaking, it's them actually meeting their goal, right? Well, these are the kind of things that actually can be done. And we have structured this, and most importantly, we have made it in a way that would be financial. Because that's the other big issue about all these, everything that the government wants to be done. It needs to be financial. I mean, somebody's gonna have to put the money. The only part of everything that we've been discussing where the private sector likes to control the money and doesn't necessarily look for direct financing is in the EMP side. And it's because at least their first phases of exploration, I mean, the big IOCs, the international coal companies, they have the pockets. They prefer to control that part, not being subject to actually provide. They control that also through the market, through also the monetization of reserves, which, by the way, some of you may ask, so how can you monetize reserves if in Mexico the reserves are from the Mexican government? You said that, right? Well, the SEC in the US acknowledges that really these rules that apply in the US are exceptional. But on the other side, the SEC acknowledges that they are not an international authority, right? And they are not an authority that could actually qualify whether a contract of another country would qualify to monetize reserves or not. So what they did was they did like a catalog of certain principles. So to the extent that the license that the private company has or the contract that they have is close to something that would give them sufficient control of what is going to happen with all the resources once produced, they allow you to do this and allow you to reflect in your books and monetize and bring to today's value whatever reserves you may have. And so it is possible to do it. And actually, for instance, right now, many of the companies, Mexico actually developed a number of big rounds from 2014 until 2018. And many of these companies actually obtained licenses or contracts, EMP contracts or licenses. And at the same time, immediately, whenever they were able to prove that they had like 1P reserves or 3P reserves, depending on the type of reserve, they were able to prove that, they were authorized actually to reflect in their books of those reserves. And at the same time, when the last administration started giving uncertainty on what they were going to allow or not, then they decided, you know what, I'm going to slow down on the level of investment I'm going to do. Because, you know, it's not the same to lose like $400 million than to lose $4 billion, right? And in many cases, since they were not able to increase their amount of reserves, they decided actually to just give back some of these contracts and licenses, unfortunately. So we're going to have to wait and see what this new administration actually does on that front and how they're going to handle it. The other important point here is that at least it is considered that by 2030, the installed capacity in Mexico is going to have to increase from 355 terawatts to 435. And this is important because we're talking about 90 terawatts. That requires a lot of investment. Where that investment is going to come from, they are considering that at least part of that is going to be CFE investment, another part Pemex, and then the smaller part from the private sector. That doesn't add up. The government doesn't have the money for that. So again, the only alternative is to do it through association with the private sector, one way or the other. So now, another tricky point on all this messy plan that they have, which again conflicts with reality in many ways, is just CO2 emissions and energy transition. So all of this, because all of this, as you can actually identify, implies supporting a lot of dirty energy production, right? And on the other hand, Mexico is part of the Paris Accord, which actually, according to the Paris Accord, we had some some immediate objectives that needed to be met by 2025, didn't happen. And then we have another deadline on 2030, 2035, and so goes on until 2050. And of course, many of these things doesn't add up. But on the other side, the new president has said that she wants to focus on renewable energies and energy transitions, but there is no real plan to match everything that I have described with how you're going to actually be able to achieve that. And that's where I've been talking to some of our colleagues here at the University of Texas and at the IBA, just thinking, look, guys, we need to bring the government ideas and real ideas. These are opportunities, not only to position the university, but also to position Texas. Because Texas is by far one of the best positioned energy hubs in the world for energy transitions. And I didn't understand that until last year when we had meetings and discussions with Jason and with Professor Weber, and they were explaining us how many of the oil and gas infrastructure installed in Texas could be actually converted to produce green energy in many ways, like hydrogen and other sources. And of course, we have the largest interconnection today between the US and Mexico, with respect to power is with Texas. But we need to increase that because the characteristics of the grid in Mexico and in the US, they have different ranges of power. So you require a lot of interconnection infrastructure in order for that flow to actually, let me say again, just to flow the right way and as fast as needed according to the needs of both markets. And also, with respect to renewable energies, the potential in Mexico, as I said before, 2/3 of the country basically are semi-desertic. So the potential for wind farms and for solar, is there. I mean, the photovoltaic capacity in Mexico by square feet is, one of the highest in the world. So, of course, many of these places lack interconnectivity and infrastructure. And one of the excuses that the last government used to actually shut down or slow down renewable energy projects was actually the argument that they actually cause instability in the system, which, if it's not done properly, it actually could be true, but then do it the right way, right? So now they want to focus on installing like storage, big batteries, say in a way, capacity, which we know that the technology needs to also still be developed, but that's another big challenge. And electromobility, that's the other one. I mean, the new president has said that she wants to promote more electric cars in public transportation and in private as well. And also, but in order to do that, they want to actually develop a plan to install charging centers and terminals in the main actually toll roads in Mexico. So there's a lot to do. This represents a lot of opportunities. There's still an active and ongoing dialogue that are going on with the new government because, as we have said, many of the things they want and how they want to do it conflicts with what is more practical and what could be acceptable for the private sector and also for the owners of money. So, and just to finalize, they also want to increase. In Mexico, we only have one nuclear power plant, which is Laguna Verde, which is in Veracruz, Mexico. I have had the opportunity, I'm actually working currently with one of the contractors that is working in increasing installations for Laguna Verde, but they want to increase in 14,000 megawatts the installation of the capacity of Laguna Verde, which, by the way, Laguna Verde is the most important power plant in Mexico because that's the one that is used for the jumpstart of the system every day, and the one that actually provides certain level of stability. And the other thing they want to do is they are at the regulatory agencies level. There has been a lot of gossip that they're going to disappear. Apparently, they're not going to disappear. They're just going to be reorganized in many ways. But the most important thing is that, just to give you an example, there are approximately 776 megawatts of permits that require to be modified and that are right now on a bottleneck, and approximately 1,400 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts that of potential that could be developed pretty quickly, just if the regulatory agencies start working the way they do. That actually has a challenge because many of the technical guys that used to work there are gone. So bringing actually the manpower to handle that is not going to be easy, but it's possible. We did it back in the 90s. And I think my suggestion to the government is, okay, you're going to have to do outsourcing. Just hire them, on the side, and if later on you can offer them a good deal, probably you can hire them back, but that's the only way to handle it. So as you can see, this actually just reflects how ideology, practicity needs to find a way to resolve many of these issues. And again, at least for me, and that's one of the ideas we're sharing with the government, interconnectivity with the US. It's of the essence. Because again, we need to work together to have this North American energy hub and be the envy of the rest of the world. Thank you.
That's one question from online, but raise your hand if you have a question in the room as well. Here's a topic, a question about how the current Mexican administration thinks about the emissions trading system, CO2 price. Is there anything to say about how that works or what the future thought of the emissions trading system is in Mexico?
Yes, that's a really good question, and it's an unfortunate fact. Because when the reform in 2014 happened and the new projects actually in the market was taking a good shape, nobody knew how to value the trading emission system because there was none, right? So in the different bids for the new renewable energy projects, working with clients, they were saying, okay, what value do I put here, right? Because I don't have any comparison in the market. There's no market yet. So we use comparables from other markets, and with the intention of saying, well, probably the market is going to actually go the right way, and this is going to become a real asset, financial asset for the project. Unfortunately, it was the last administration decided that why not the Mexican power utility was going to be able to issue also emission certificates, right? Why not? They thought, and they said, well, we need them to be also competitive. Say, well, but you basically generate dirty power, so how are you going to actually? Well, it doesn't matter. So just by a check, the power utility is going to be able to issue, I don't know, X number of certificates and dump the market. So at the end of the day, what happened was that these trade emission certificates value became zero at this stage. Part of the discussion with respect to energy transition is we need to do something with this market because we're part of an international treaty, and we have to acknowledge and we have to respect for these international companies or Mexican companies doing business abroad. Exactly, we need to give them certainty of their trade emission certificates, how they're going to be valued and traded in the future. Unfortunately, right now we don't have an answer to that.
So you mentioned like developing some of Mexico's shale resources and things, but that would be like a new technology and like a new for Mexico would be a new step. Is like how long do you think it would? Will the government allow like I guess the private investment that it would take to then maybe teach Pemex how to do that? But I mean, it's not. It might take a while before that.
No, it's a good question. If you ask me, and that's what I've been telling this think tanks and the transition group for the government, you need to allow the private sector to do it. Of course, in the last 10, 12 years, there has been a lot of discussion about how fracking actually affects the environment and if it pollutes water. Of course, there has been a really hard learning process because the type of technology and the type of chemicals that have been used now are not the same that used to be used like 12, 50 years ago. Yeah. So the private sector first needs to explain the government how the environmental impact is gonna be mitigated in many ways. And then tell them, look, I can bring Pemex here to learn, but it's gonna be me handling things. And that's the way it has happened in many other markets, not on fracking necessarily, but allowing actually the NOC to be part of your process. They're not gonna actually get a part of the profit, but you can give them actually the option to start stepping up if they have money later. And at the same time, they're gonna be learning on how things are done. Because the problem is time. I mean, you don't have time, so if you're gonna bring, you need to make sure of two things which have not been a good history in Mexico. First, you need to bring the best of the best. Because if you bring the second best, they cannot guarantee the results. Or the third layer, they may not actually guarantee the results. And unfortunately, we had a bad experience with that back on 2020, between 2008 and 2011, when oilfield services were open partially. Well, E&P was partially open through service contracts. And as you can imagine, the quality of the contractors that arrived was not good. So the outcome wasn't good. So they ended up having a lot of disputes between Pemex and these contractors. And when we were reviewing this dispute was, well, Pemex, why in the first place did you actually allow these guys to arrive, right? There might be many answers which I don't want to speculate about that could actually resolve that question. But now you need to actually make sure that whatever you put together is attractive to have the best contractors arriving, and they're going to bring the best experience and the best quality of technology and of chemicals in order to mitigate any potential environmental risk. Because that's part of the reason why the government in the past didn't wanted to allow fracking and shale production.
All right, I'm gonna ask a question which is kind of related, and then go to the room. So, it's a question which is taken in the context of trying to bring in hydraulic fracturing into Mexico. So the first part, can you talk more about physical appropriation risk for U.S. E&P firms if they're partnering in Mexico? Is there some risk that their assets will get taken? Is it different now than it was in the past? And also the question is talking about your proposition that allowing hydraulic fracturing in the Eagle Ford could help lessen the control of cartels.
Yes.
That sounds like even more complicated to me. So how do you kind of see this working, and can you hire enough people given this sort of bring in the experts to do the work versus don't have the expertise in Mexico? Maybe you use some level of low skilled labor or not. How do you?
All right. So the first part of the question is, the good news is we still have a tree. We don't know after today if we're going to continue to have a tree or not. No, we're going to have a tree. I mean, for sure, it's going to be renegotiated. I mean, it's not going to be a revision of the tree in 2026, and it's going to start actually next year, and it's going to be a renegotiation. We know that. I mean, that's fine. The question, but the important thing is there is a treaty, and that treaty actually protects foreign investment from nationalizations or asset appropriation, and actually provides certain specific boundaries for that. That's one thing. The other thing is that every E&P license, at least granted for by the government so far, they also allow for international arbitration at the UN Trade Committee. So that actually gives also, which has a lot of experience in dealing with oil and gas type of appropriation situation. And the second part, we have to remember that some E&P firms have done work in the worst parts of the world, and in Africa, in Asia, places with civil war. I don't know how these guys do it, but they produce, and they make sure that their product actually is shipped and it goes wherever it needs to go. So again, this is a discussion that I have had with clients here in Texas and other places where they have said, look, we know how to do it. We just need to make sure that my people who are providing us the necessary security have clearance to do what they need to do. So allow me to do it. And that is actually a challenging and question for the Mexican government, because our history is not that good with the US on that front. In the past, whenever they allowed actually certain areas of Mexico to be controlled by the US in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Basically, they treated that area like US, right? And of course, that's the tricky part about it. But to be honest, it's just like hiring private security and like allow them to do what they need to do for work with that. It would require certain protocols, yes. You would need to negotiate with the government because again, this is an additional expense. Right? You're taking public security in your hands instead of allowing the government to take it because the government cannot take it. So, but it is possible. Now, if the government wants to take care of it, all right, then you make sure that this happens, right? Okay.
Yeah, quick question. So for CFE to keep that 54-46 split that you said, is the strategy then to repeat the whole Iberdrola situation? And if so, what are the TMEC implications for that?
That is an excellent question because the Iberdrola situation was a mimic, to say in a way. I mean, because at the end it didn't generate new investment. You just actually took public money to buy capacity that was already installed capacity and shifted from private to public, which by the way is owned by a private equity fund. That it's not owned directly by the government, but it's reflected like if it was actually a government. So, but the Iberdrola case plus the 12 megawatts, 12,000 megawatts that have been built by the technology company Siemens, Mitsubishi, and GE that need to start operation in 2025. In practice, it's going to generate the Mexican government to have 64% of the portfolio. So this allows like an additional 10% for the private sector to actually develop without actually affecting the mix. And on top of that, again, as I was saying, is more cosmetic, but in fact, you can do all these other PPP structures with the government for the government to say, hey, like you're like case, yeah, that's my power, and I do it, so I count it as part of portfolio. And that's really what's gonna. The big question for the private sector is, all right, I'm gonna obtain assurance that whatever the government is going to give me, either fuel or other kind of any kind of payment from the government requires to have a registration one way or the other in public finance, right? So what kind of registration is going to give me to assure me that whatever commitments the government has are going to be properly, will have all the formalities? That answer, I do have an idea of how to resolve it, but that's something that needs to be worked.
Okay, so one thing about Mexico that I'm interested in is like the Gulf of Mexico, because I'm a geologist by training. So yeah, as we know that US has drilled so many oil fields in Gulf of Mexico. So I just want to know the dynamic between US and Mexico in terms of offshore oil and gas industry. I mean, like, is there any regulation that controls the dynamic between the US and Mexico, and how would Mexico benefit from so many fields that the US have drilled in Gulf of Mexico or something like that? Yeah, I just want to know that.
That's an excellent question because first of all, similar to what we were discussing on the Eagle Port Basin, the same thing applies in certain areas, especially in the deep water areas of Mexico. So now in Mexico, because many of the companies that are developing in the US, they say, look, I already have experience, right? I got to Mexico and do it. Nevertheless, we know that deep water is quite challenging and quite risky. And you can have all the investment there and you can have invested billions of dollars and you don't produce one single barrel of oil, right? Or gas. So there is one specific treaty between the US and Mexico that actually covers certain specific basins. One is called the Donut Hole. That it's a quite large asset. The US knows that it would be unproductive to start producing on their side if the other side is not producing. Because you can decompensate actually the basin and you can end up with a really bad result. So Mexico, more than 10 years ago, started negotiating a treaty with the US And so they said, okay, so whenever we start, we need to wait. I mean, basically the grounding rules were set there. I think that something similar is gonna happen with other basins as far as they being actually developed. Of course, Mexico, at least on the shallow water side, that's really where Pemex has experience. But the biggest problem is deep water. Because that requires a lot of investment and experience, which because of a mistake that I was describing that happened 50 years ago, Mexico doesn't have a really experience right now on deep water, and definitely needs to. What they were doing is teaming up with the Mexican with the international IOCs or the NOCs from other countries. But again, if the question is okay, Pemex, but in the meantime, we're gonna team up. What are you bringing to the table? I'm gonna get the permits. No, I can get that on my own, right? So that's why the deep water developments in Mexico has slowed down, and we're gonna have to wait and see.
Oh, yes. Hi, Ariel. I'm Associate Director here at Research Relations, and my area of expertise is energy, actually. So you described my childhood because my dad was an executive at Pemex growing up in Mexico, and when I got here, the devaluation of the peso was horrible. How am I gonna pay my tuition? So thank you for that
Oh, sorry.
incredible history of what I went through, many families, of course, I'm imagining. So my question is related to the private public collaborations that happen, like FAM in Monterrey or Fondo de Agua, where there comes like money from the government and money from private industry. I'm not as familiar with how they then together can potentially sponsor research, let's say, from the University of Texas. Like how would that work, and how would that move the needle for an initiative in Mexico?
That's an excellent question, and we have been actually the IBA talking about that. The bad news is that right now Mexico, in terms of they want to promote research, there's actually a big chapter. I mentioned it, but there's a big chapter about promoting research. But what they want to do is put money into Mexican research centers like the Mexican Petroleum Institute that were forgotten for many years. So I'm not sure how that's going to work. But the good news is that there is a lot of international funding available to team up with Mexico to offer support to institutions like the University of Texas or others to bring work as think tanks and bring these ideas. In the case of water, there was a big program that was called Promagua, the Mexican water program, which what the intention was to start develop, first of all, organize the different jurisdictions that were related to water basin, right? And put them under the wing of the federal government, put the federal support, financial support, and work together with the private sector for to develop actually water treatment plants and renew transmission lines, because one of the biggest problems with water in Mexico is that all the water pipelines are really old, and you have a lot of filtrations. That's not a problem. So that program, it seemed that it was going to go the right way, but unfortunately, politicians went into the way, and they decided. Many governments were from the same color of the federal government, and they started saying back then, let me handle it. I think I can handle it. And since it was federal funding, because the problem with water is that water as such is not a good business. You require a lot of governmental subsidies, right? And the federal government said, in a really big projects like Totonico, which is one of the third largest water treatment plant in the world, that would resolve actually issues for Mexico City and the surroundings. That was a project of more than $3 billion, and they said, okay, your local government, all right, I'll let you handle it. And it was a big mistake, because at the end of the day, these local governments, they have commitments with local contractors. So in the same table, you had like top of the top international contractors. Like for instance, I was representing Korean contractors, which are really some of the best in this field. And then you had like these guys who are these guys, by the way? Then they said, well, no, they are close friends to the governor, right? That's it. What kind of experience these guys have, right? And And unfortunately, that program did not actually work the way it should. And the other problem is that water projects require a lot of time. I mean, it's not something that would, in 2 years' time would be ready actually to operate. These large projects require a lot of time in order to make them properly work. So, water is one of the big issues that we have right now, well, in the world, but in Mexico especially, because of climate change, it has become worse. And again, you're going to require the big question is what level of subsidy will the federal government be able to provide to make and how this program is going to be able to be reshaped.
All right, I think we'll cut it there so we can get to this next appointment.
Okay.
Do you want to take one?
Yes.
Oh, well.
Yeah,
Oh,
just-
yeah.
It seems, listening to you, it seems to me that the biggest advance Mexico can make in terms of meeting whatever your objectives are under the Paris Treaty is to fix your existing infrastructure, bring some economies into your existing infrastructure, the venting of gas, for example, capturing that and getting it into somewhere that you can generate currency from it. Financing those types of projects is much easier than financing a solar or wind farm. Are you concerned at all that some of these green options that are being pressed globally might take away from the basic need to get your infrastructure, power infrastructure, pipeline infrastructure, refining, manufacturing, to capture all of the gains that can be made there that could overwhelm anything that could happen near term with some of these green initiatives?
That's a really good question. The short answer is, at least the last administration didn't care anything about green. Fortunately, this administration is saying that they do care, but if you read the plan,
Yeah,
it's more focused on another. I agree with you about capturing of this gas, but the big question, talking to my finance clients in New York and in the UK, most of them are shutting down anything that has to do with that energy or gas, associated gas, and oil. So it's quite challenging. You're probably obtaining funding from other sources like private equity funds might do, but the big problem is the ISG right now. I mean, all these compliance initiatives and the rules. One of the biggest problems, very quickly, that we discussed in the IBA meeting in Dubai back in February. We were there and it was fantastic. We didn't know how many engineers from, Josh was there, from companies like Saudi Aramco are from school.
Yeah.
And not only that, head engineers of the associations of international engineers of oil and gas, blah, blah, blah. And they were just saying, look, one of the problems with the Paris Accord is that this principle of zero emissions it's unrealistic. We need to talk about zero net emissions. So tell people, all right, you're going to have emissions, but then you have to net them with something that actually absorbs, like, for instance, we didn't talk about it, but all these initiatives for carbon, CO2 absorption are of the essence. Like, for instance, I was having a meeting with, talking again about water, talking about some client that is helping some Germans, saying, okay, so we have global warming, right? So this means more humidity, right? Well, let's condensate that humidity and make it drinkable water. And they have developed the technology, but only for a smaller scale enterprise, not really at a larger scale, but it's going to happen. This is the kind of thinking that we need to actually have. And you guys here are the ones who are going to develop that kind of thinking, and how to make it actually viable. I think that's the other. And the last question, please.
Maybe that's what. Thanks for your conference. I was also born and raised in Mexico, and I still remind us if it was yesterday the December errors. My family almost lost everything. So my question is regarding lithium. What's your take on the lithium? Because Mexico has big reserves, and they were supposed to have some concessions for the Chinese, and now in the last year they just quit all of those things. And do you think we're going to miss that opportunity just as we did with shale gas and petroleum?
The answer is yes. Because unfortunately, they included in the Constitution something they didn't need to include because it was already there. saying that the minerals are of the Mexican state, similar to oil, the oil reserves. The ruling is every mineral underground is of the state. Fine. Okay, but now when you produce it, allow private companies to just actually market it, right? And so right now, if you ask me, there's no real plan. There's no viability. They are giving this to Pemex. Like if Pemex doesn't have things to care about, they want to Pemex to create Pemex lithium or something like that. But it's already created, I think. They created by decree. And my question last time was, okay, what are these guys doing? Well, so far nothing. Are they going to be able to do something? I don't think so. Now, the other big thing is nobody knows really what's the real potential of Mexico on that market because the few concessionaires at the time, which concessions were canceled, that were starting to do exploration to determine what was the capacity of those basins, were not allowed really to complete the work. And of course, Pemex Lithium doesn't have money or people to do that work. So if you ask me, we're going to continue to just import lithium from other places, and probably in a later time, somebody will come with this idea about let's change the constitution again and let's just allow somebody else to do it. That's my personal.
You can call it Linux. So, all right, well, thank you very much for.